Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the Performance Mindset Show. I'm your host, Amy Calandrino, CEO of Beyond Commercial and author of the book From Perfect to Real. It's actually an Amazon bestseller. This show is all about leveling up in business, real estate, leadership, and life by shifting how you think, grow, and lead. So each week, I'm going to bring to you conversations with top performers and mindset experts who are building big lives on their own. If you're ready to ditch perfection, trust your path, and grow with intention, you're in the right place. Please sure to subscribe and let's get into it. I got approached about Max Stevens being on my podcast, and when I read his press kit, I was like, fuck yeah. So he has a book coming out that is What the Fuck Do You Really Want? The No Nonsense Guide to Finding a Life of Purpose. So I really related to a lot with what was described as being in the book. I also learned a bit about Max's background and was like, this is a great fit for our listeners. So I promise we probably won't have too many more expletives, so maybe enough to spice it up for those that enjoy that type of vernacular, but not too much to turn those away later on in the show. So welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I was looking forward to talking to you.
So tell us a little bit about your professional journey and how you've kind of come to write this book and get into your line of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was lucky / unfortunate that I grew up with some unfortunate circumstances. Having one of my parents has a lot of challenges with opioid addiction. I grew up in that household, and so I became for all intents and purposes, sort of a practical psychologist, where I was sort of studying my dad and his sort of patterns of behavior and trying to do my best to help him. And that got me very, very interested in human behavior, by and large, to sort of solve my own emotional pain that I was going through at the time. How the book sort of came about was I've been very, very blessed to work with some exceptionally high performing people. And the first process by which the book sort of came about is I wanted to document all of the patterns that I observed in such people. And so I ended up writing, over 100 research articles on human behavior, all of which are sort of sitting on my website at the moment. And that then turned into what has now been called the book.
What did you really first get into psychology while growing up? Were you a teenager by that point, or even before then?
Yeah. So I definitely I had the belief, from pretty early on, that if my dad had loved me more, then he would have been able to get healthy and clean. And so that sort of internalized early belief got me very, very interested in the sort of pursuit of, sort of Western consumerist success, because in my approximation when I was young, even took me years to articulate it like this, Amy, but in my approximation when I was young, is that if I had become successful enough, then my dad would have turned and looked at me and said, I love you and I see you, and all those things that he wasn't able to really do when I was young. And so that then sort of moved me into sort of personal development, where I went to India, and during my time in India, there was a guy that I sort of met on the side of the road who was clearly homeless and was meditating, and he was crying. And I went up to him and I asked him and I said, excuse me, sir, I don't speak the language. I just wanted to check if you were okay. And he looked up at me and he said, oh, no, I'm perfectly fine. Thank you for asking. And I said, oh, wow, you speak like perfect English. And he said, yeah. And I've traveled around. And I said, yeah, I was just checking on you. Like, are you okay? And he said, oh, no. These are happy tears. And I said, oh, that's great. What are you so happy about? And he said, no, nothing. Like, I just am. And that experience always stayed with me, because even at the time, how old would I have been? 17 or something like that. I thought to myself, I have more already than what he'll ever have, and yet he's happier than I'll ever be. And so that got me very, very curious that maybe there was a flaw in my plan that of just becoming as successful as possible would solve all my problems. And And so that then very much got me into meditation. And many thousands of hours later of meditating, that belief left me. And so on the other side of working through that, it became very sort of obvious, particularly because I was surrounded by a lot of high performers at the time, because I was doing a lot of work with athletes. It was very obvious to me at the time that not only that that's something that I was doing, but that's something that most of the high performing people that I was surrounded by do also. And so that then moved me into coaching, which then moved into the book.
What I find interesting about meditating is that it's much more of an inward flex that you have versus the outward, things that people do, and having that time inside meditating is so valuable. But a lot of people feel like they don't have the time, or they won't invest the time. What types of tips do you have for someone like that isn't investing the time right now to meditate?
Yeah, great question. So by way of the thing that I've often found by way of time is like no more than 20 minutes is required, to sort of start the habit. 20 minutes is a perfect sort of optimal time. The big sort of misunderstanding in my estimation anyway, the big misunderstanding that we have in Western culture, at least, about meditating, is that the practice of meditation is supposed to make you feel peaceful. And so the idea that shows up for me, at least insofar as I got taught in India, is that if you think about it like this, like if you go to a therapist, for example, and you sit on that therapist's couch, the thing that the therapist is trying to do is they are trying to get emotional pain points to sort of come to the surface in that conversation. And then if they can bring those to the surface, they can then get dealt with and resolved, right? And so meditation works in just the same way, in that what happens when we meditate is that our emotional pain points start to come to the surface. And that's exactly what's supposed to happen. And on the other side of letting those come to the surface, letting those be seen, letting those be understood, just simply by holding the space for them, they then sort of reintegrate back into the psyche, and then you have your peace, right? But in my view, certainly just by way of common conversations that I've had with people about meditation, is that they think, I've tried, but I can't get my mind to be still, and I can't get, they'll sort of lay out these reasons that sort of presupposes that they are failing in some way, but they're not failing at all. Like, that's exactly what's supposed to happen. Your mind is not supposed to be still, not at all. It's actually the practice of like stilling one's mind is impossible. What happens is, on the other side of allowing the mind to sort of race around and have all that pain sort of come to the surface, if we can be patient and allow that process to take place, then what happens is those pain points start to reintegrate back in, and then you sort of have your peace, quote unquote.
But it's a bit of a process.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like, have the expectation that the first year will be hell, because it will be. Definitely. Like 20 minutes a day, find 20 minutes. And I think the other thing that I'd encourage people to think about is that if you do it, it counts. So if you sit there and you're thinking about all of the things that you need to do for that day, but you manage to sit there for 20 minutes, it still counts. Like, the only thing that actually matters at the beginning is the setting of the habit. It's not too dissimilar to any other healthy habits, whether that be the gym or anything to do with one's health. It's like when one begins to go for a run, is one's technique perfect? Probably not, but I think in the beginning, the most important thing is that one starts.
I would agree with that. There's a lot of people that it's sometimes hard to get started on something. I think meditation personally is something I struggle with, and it's not something that I do on the daily, but it is beneficial when I do it. So yeah. And I would like to work up some more. I think I'm maybe like 3 minutes.
Yeah. That's great.
So one thing is interesting is I noticed that you have a process of psychological re-engineering, and I don't frequently hear that term. What describe to us what that is, and how it can be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So The first place that I always start with any business owner that I work with is that the chokehold of your business is your personal psychology, because all of the core decisions are funneled through your psychology, right? If you're the key decision maker and you're the one who has to make those decisions, the way that I think about it, and I've explained it to business owners in the past, is think about it like this. What you're coming to me for is you want better outcomes, right? Whatever, insert whatever outcome you want, right? Outcomes are driven by behavior, right? So whatever you do, in some ways, well, not in some ways, whatever you do dictates for what outcomes you get. Whatever you do, in other words, your behavior is driven by your decisions. So whatever you decide then dictates behavior, then dictates outcomes. But your decisions are driven by your thinking, right? So it goes thinking, decisions, behavior, outcome. And your thinking is driven by your worldview. Now, the challenge with the human sort of epistemology or the human condition is that our worldview is not transparent to us. So in other words, like one of the things that I say to business owners who might be a bit skeptical about the process is I say, just notice, like when you look out at the world, you can see very, very clearly that people are their own worst problem in some way, right? And most business owners would go, yep, yeah, that's true, I can see that. And I say, right. So, and then I'll say, right. And now when we look throughout human history and we see all of the crazy things that we've done to each other and to the planet and to our animals and all sorts of stuff, right, throughout history, and all these people believe that they were doing the right thing, we can see very clearly that they were self-deceived in some way. And he went, oh, and the business owner might go, oh yeah, definitely. And then I go, okay, let's bring this closer to home. Now look around just even at your immediate family. Can you see that they are their own worst problem in some way? And they might say, oh yeah, definitely. And then I'd say, right, but not you. And I'd say, how'd you get so lucky that you were the only person who was transparent to themselves? So, but again, just notice, right, like when I look out at the world, we can see from a second person position that people are their own worst problem. But from my position, from a first person position, it doesn't look like I'm my worst problem. It looks like the world is in some ways my challenge, right? And so the process of psychological reengineering is the idea of let's actually work at the what would you call it, at the level of worldview. So then it has a cascading effect, around sort of decisions. I have a challenge with the coaching industry that most coaches are really just accountability buddies. They don't really actually grow the person beyond just holding them accountable to goals that they've set and stuff like that. So, for example, if I have I've often tell this story, like I had a business owner who came to me once years ago who said, I want to work with you because I want to double the size of the revenue in the business. And the first question out of my mouth was, okay, well, why do you want that? You could have come to me for anything, right? Can you tell me why you want that? Why did that come forward? And he said to me, so I can prove to all of those people that said I couldn't do it, that I can. And I said, well, don't you think a better use of our time is just to forgive those people? Because then you wouldn't have to do it at all. So like I'm trying to operate at the level of like the thing that actually births the motivation in the first place, rather than sort of going like, yeah, sure, let's break this up into a 27-step plan, and just sort of skipping right over the fact that this is actually born from a pain point rather than actually being born because it's something that he genuinely wants. So half of those people, like we actually throughout the process of working with this person, all those people that he was going to prove wrong had already forgotten what they said.
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes if your goals are driven by a sense of status or you're doing something for status, that's not necessarily the best use of your time. And it's not going to lead to long-term growth because it's not something you necessarily want. You're doing it because you think other people want you to have that car, or that you think that someone else wants you to have that thing. Actually, I just finished, I don't know if you've read this book, The 5 Types of Wealth by Sohail Bloom. It is so good. He talks a lot about that in his book. Actually, I owe him a review. I love to read books, so I will definitely be reading your book when it comes out. But it's interesting, though. He says, going down the road of status, which it sounds like that person was, you really can run afoul of a lot of different things by doing that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, that I've had many conversations with business owners about is that desire for like Western consumerist levels of success. It's a mimetic desire. What I mean by that is like it's a culturally conditioned idea. It's not necessarily like really, really yours. You know, the idea of sort of mimetic desires are desires that we sort of inherit, that we sort of we think are ours, but actually have just been sort of humdrummed into us through decades of advertising, cultural programming, repeated messaging, etc., etc. And so the idea, part of, I got asked this once, if I could speak to all of my clients and they were to tell me what's been the value of like working with me, is I haven't actually done this, but my approximation of what they might share would be something along the lines of, Max really helps me sort of work out what I actually want rather than what I think I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
Certainly.
I've been through a journey in myself of figuring out. I think I published a book recently, and it's all about my journey of like me basically wanted throwing the towel on my business because I chased for so long what I thought other people wanted, and it left me, just mentally bankrupt, at the end of the process. And so I think living with a different level of intentionality, and then also working with someone who can help you do that, and then also building your business at the same time would be very valuable.
Oh yeah, no, certainly. Tell me about that. What was that like for you?
So I got to the point with my kids and then building my business, and I thought, well, the bigger the business, the more successful I'm going to be viewed. And so I went on a pursuit, got up to about like 10 agents. And at the end of the day, I started managing people, which isn't really what I love to do. I like solving problems, more like business and commercial real estate problems for people. So I wasn't even doing what I like to do. And then I was losing a whole bunch of money while doing it, while also trying to raise a couple of kids. So at the end of the day, I just wasn't very fulfilled. And so I got through that journey and realized from some friends that a lot of other people go through that. And so I went on this quest starting about 3 years ago to build up my mindset. And part of that was having a podcast about mindset. So definitely researching a lot more about it and just changing really the way I think, and then really understanding what is most important to me, what is most important to my family, and living with that level of purpose and intentionality.
Do you mind me asking like what you found? Like you were saying you were trying to find deeper levels of purpose and what was important to you. What did you find?
My kids. It's like, because at the end of the day, once they're you spend majority of time. They say studies say that you spend the majority of your time when they're little, and so I don't really work necessarily a traditional schedule, but it works for me and it works for the clients that are similar and that appreciate and understand I can get done the same amount of work. So I just basically had to go back down to the studs and then rebuild my organization with the right support staff and making it that I could do the work, but I was supported so that I could be the mom that, like last week I took off and did like field day with my son at his school, or go to Mother's Day tea, or, I'm going to take a few weeks off in Vermont and rent an A frame and go hiking every morning with my kids and go pick berries. So, like, that's what I want. And I want to also help my clients level up. So, I just found that I like doing what I do, but I needed to make it in a digestible size for me, and then not compare myself to other people that maybe are much larger organizations, but that this is enough for me and it's perfect for me.
Perfect. Sounds awesome.
Yeah. They're happy. And they tell me that they love me every day, which is great because I feel like I'm not like where I was before, peeling into the parking lot at 6 o'clock before the daycare closed. And now some days I'm picking them up at 2. Sometimes I'm picking them up like, we're doing dinner together, and it's not a perfect process. Obviously, I take a day off for myself a week and all that kind of stuff, but it's a totally different landscape for me. Or I don't know, how do you call it, construct. What have you really kind of discovered though about the human potential? Because we're talking about a little bit about my story, and then obviously you've worked with dozens of other people. What have you kind of discovered about entrepreneurs and athletes and those you work with?
Uh, Number one is that they are often very miserable in spite of what they say. Um, they are often very miserable. By way of their potential, the the upside in working with the people that I do is that they have a tremendous amount of drive, which is great, and they are real results makers, which is also great. The the challenge the challenge for them is, not too dissimilar to my own. The challenge for them is that they have an internal sort of wound that they are seeking to heal through an external result, and that can never happen. And so, like, one of the things I say to them is I say, like, you're already on the green side of goals that you said would make you happy, like, and the other thing I've said is, just notice, like, when you first started your business, you would have killed someone to be in the position you're in now, and you're no happier than you were before. And so it speaks in some ways to the idea that there's a misalignment somewhere. And so my work is really about sort of reorienting what they believe to be what they approximate to be a meaningful life. And so on the other side of sort of doing that, they still have all this drive. They still have all this drive and focus and all those wonderful things that make them a high performer. But they are sort of orienting them in a way that sort of not only works for them, but also is of service to the world. And that's sort of, in my view, you were speaking about potential before. The pattern that I sort of tend to observe is that our highest potential is selflessness. Definitely.
What you said one more time? You said the highest?
Our highest potential is selflessness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it interesting that you talk about a way to kind of meld together what not only works for the person, but is also of use to the world. And that is kind of what I had to find is, and again, I'm not the right fit for everyone. If someone wants someone who's going to be turned on 24 hours a day, like, I'm not necessarily that right person. But obviously, if emergency does pop up, I make myself available for like a true emergency. I try to find those that I'm in alignment with and I can deliver value to within the construct that works for me and keeps me in the best mindset to then focus on what's most important to me. Tell me one mindset shift that someone can immediately put into place to help them in their professional and personal lives.
Yeah. So one of the most counterintuitive sort of shifts that one can have, and I've said this to clients in the past, is that if you want a better life, stop thinking about you. And so that's a really, really wonderful place to start. So success, if you like when we think about what we sort of do professionally, when we wake up and everybody goes to work, what we are essentially doing is being of service to somebody else. So we either have a goods and services business or a goods business or a service business, right? And so the idea is, like, the business doesn't exist for us. The business exists for the customers, right? And so if we can orient ourselves by way of trying to be of maximal service to other people, success just becomes a natural byproduct of doing that. And so, I talk a little bit about the sort of book, that's sort of what the book is about. It's about finding the thing, right, that you want to do that basically allows you to position yourself to be of maximal service to the world. And success, if you like success by way of material goods, comes as a byproduct of doing that. The thing that I've often found by way of what gets in the way is a lot of people tend to put the cart before the horse, in that they say, I want to earn this, right? So they'll start there rather than starting with how they want to be of service, because they often believe that that these things delineate, whereby my passion or my purpose, if you like, and what earns me money are not the same thing. And so my sort of work has been about reconciling this to ensure that that actually is not the case. By way of mindset shifts, the thing that I have found, if you look at like brain scans, right, and you look at people who have high symptoms of anxiety and depression and the part of their brain that sort of lights up, right, and then you have a quote unquote healthy person next to them, and then you ask that healthy person to think about themselves, the exact same parts of the brain start to light up. So in other words, like rumination or thinking about ourselves, like, is the pathway to sort of to feeling anxious and depressed fundamentally. And so one of the biggest shifts that one can have is, if you're not doing too good at the moment, go and help somebody else with something and you'll feel better. I guarantee it.
I think that's a very helpful thing to do. I think one of the things I did for Lent is focused on doing something for someone else every single day on top of what I normally would do, and I found an incredible satisfaction from doing that. So, but I think just even on the daily, whether it's smiling at someone or holding the elevator for someone or buying Starbucks for the car, for the car behind you, and getting out of your own head can be very helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like if you think about it, I've said this many times. If you think about it this is like literally what I lay out in the first chapter of the book is, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, like for hundreds of thousands or anywhere from tens to hundreds of thousands of years, like our ancestors lived in tribes in the forest. And so your quote unquote success, was predicated upon the contribution that you made to that tribe. Did you go and get the berries? Did you go and catch the fish? Did you go and hunt the animal? If you brought it back to the tribe, you were celebrated, right? And so now, like, the challenge for us by way of like the mental health crisis and different sort of epidemics that we're sort of facing by way of our mental health, is that we have designed cultures that sort of in some ways go against our own biological wiring. We've built these, like you and I live in sort of quote unquote developed Western countries, and in those countries we have a very individualistic sort of idea of what success looks like. Amy, you're out for you, I'm out for me. If we can help each other along the way, like we can, but by and large, you're out for you and I'm out for me, right? And so, and that sort of MO, right? That sort of modus operandi, it actually goes against what we're wired for. Like and this is like one of the things I talk about in the book is like, dogs are dogs. They might have different personalities, they might have different temperaments, they might have different, whatever, but they're all still dogs. A dog needs play, food, affection, whatever. You deny any dog those needs and the dog suffers. And part of the challenge that we have, in my approximation at least, within our current culture is because we live in this like hyper individualistic culture, right? We sort of have these axiomatic assumptions that basically say, well, we're all different, man. And, like what works for me might not work for somebody else, and what works for somebody else might not work for me. And so the problem in my estimation, at least, with that line of thinking, is it tends to lend itself to the idea that we have to design lives that sort of work for us, rather than relying on the fact that we actually are human beings who have human being needs. We are wired for contribution. We are wired for connection. We are wired for community. Like these are the things. This is a brand new idea. The whole idea that you live for you and I'll live for me. This is a brand new sort of thing. Maybe like basically post-industrial revolution. Is really sort of when this sort of individualistic idea sort of came online. If we look at sort of stages of psychological development collectively and individually, but before that, we're all sort of living in tribes. And so now your tribe isn't just like your little local corner of the forest. You're in the United States, I'm in Australia, and we can contribute to each other. And so now like your tribe is like the world. So the question no longer becomes, what do you want to contribute to your tribe? What do you want to contribute to the world? Because you can. My lovely fiance is from Mexico, and she does a lot of work with Latin American women, and she lives with me here in Sydney, in Australia, so I think, and so part of the book and my work, is about reorienting people back into how they can be of service to the quote unquote tribe. And a lot of those things, a lot of those quote unquote mindset shifts, if you like, just happen by default because we're living in alignment with our evolutionary biology.
It seems to me that that part of that mindset shift is just being much more open, and again, like you said, the saying dogs are dogs. I mean, humans are humans. We all have the same needs for, obviously, to be fed, have a roof over our head, but also to have, love and feel acknowledged, and all of those different things. I can't help when I watch TV to hear the rhetoric of, oh, or just even on the beach, like, well, I don't want to sit over near them. Well, who are them? You don't even know who they are. Like, people make so many assumptions about different people, but you never know what different opportunities present itself if you're open to, whether it's striking up a conversation with someone at the airport, or wherever on your journey. And just maybe part of that mindset shift is, just again, getting out of yourself, where you said, those areas of the brain are anxious, but being much more open.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's the classic thing of, like, it's the classic sort of high performer story of, oh, I achieved all this success and I thought it would make me whatever, but it didn't. And there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't. But one of the reasons why it doesn't is because one of the things that we could argue, right, is that it's the classic story of if you achieve success and you have nobody to share it with, what's it worth? And most people would say, well, not much, but if you achieve success and you have plenty of people to share it with, and you can spoil them and, share in your sort of victory and all that sort of stuff, like, what's it worth? And people say, oh man, it's the best feeling ever. And it's like, that's right. Like, that's your biological wiring. It's like, there's I would argue there's very few healthy humans, who would say, yeah, I achieved it and it was just for me and that made me feel great. Like, I don't hear that story a lot. Like, and again, like, it's our biological wiring. It's the same sort of idea when we go and spend time in nature, and we sort of watch the sunset or, whatever, and we feel this sort of sense of peace. It's like, well, what's that about? Well, what that's about is, it's your intrinsic nature sort of shining through, like, in the moment. Like, they're the environments that you lived in for hundreds of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And it's like, so what happens is we go on these, like, now we've, like, contrived these settings by way of, like, meditation retreats and wellness retreats and, stuff like that to sort of get back, quote unquote, back in touch with that feeling, but this is, like, the problem that I would argue this is a major contributing factor to the mental health crisis in the West. Like, it's, I was talking with my coach about this the other day, and he was sort of saying to me, what does it say about the state of our mental health practice that we have more mental health professionals than ever before? They are more qualified and trained than ever before, and yet it's worse than ever before. Like, like that probably tells you something, that maybe we're not doing it right.
It is just so interesting to see that, especially in our schools, in high schools, middle schools, the suicide rates, all these different things. You can't go without seeing that. I think what one can do is, like, at least what I'm trying to do is just set, a good example, and just show, like I think you said, selflessness is the highest form of
human potential. Definitely.
What's that?
Highest form of human potential. Definitely.
Highest form of human potential. Yeah. And that's just getting out of yourself, and
correct.
Hopefully others start to see this message, and maybe success isn't what you think it is, and it's something else. And speaking of, like, I mean, how do you define success nowadays?
Well, I would argue success is an output. It's not an input. So what I mean by that is that success is a byproduct. Success is not the goal. You live out your mission. You go be of maximal service to as many people as you possibly can. You will not have a problem when it comes to success. Everyone is going to want to be around you. Everybody's going to want to work with you. Everybody's gonna, both of those things. Everyone's going to want to be around you, and everyone's going to want to work with you. You will not have that problem, not at all. The challenge, like even like you can look at it even by way of this conversation, right? The second that I take my attention off of you and I start to put it on me, immediately I'd start to feel anxious. I'd worry, am I saying the right things? What does Amy think? Like, I wonder what her listeners are saying. All that sort of stuff like starts to surface when I put my attention on me. When I put my attention on you and I just try and be here with you and engage in the synergy of the conversation, all of those feelings start to die down. And so the question, that's why, like I really don't like self-help books. It's like the first thing I write in the author's note of my book, is I hate self-help books, which is true. But one of the things that a lot of personal development books sort of touch on, that whole modicum of like, follow your passion, follow your purpose, follow your, whatever. That is correct. Certainly in my approximation of it, at least, that is absolutely correct. And so all of the gains and the wins and the outcomes and all that sort of stuff just happen by default. When, I've been really lucky. I've been really lucky to work with like some of the highest performing people in the world, and I don't see them as that. Like, I don't see them as that. I just see them as a human being who's sitting opposite me that I'm just talking to. And I think that that's been really helpful because I don't see them in their sort of contrived settings of boardrooms and stuff like that. I just see them opposite me, either on Zoom or when we have a coffee or whatever. And I've been very, very lucky to do well, whether that's financially or otherwise, but it's never something that I think about,
The number one thing I'm going to take from our conversation though today, and I literally am going to put a diagram on my desk, is that it's the thinking that leads to the decisions that then leads to the behavior that then leads to the outcomes. And something I struggle with sometimes is if I get another deal, let's say, and I had this happen today. Someone that had been disloyal to me in the past didn't value my time and hired me for a project, but then ended up doing it on their own. Didn't make it right for me at all, right? And then they came back to me and they want to do another project with me, but they're leading with, how much is this going to cost me and all these different things. And I thought to myself, like, why am I going to put myself through this, like, again, just to, scarcity mindset would be like, oh, I need to have another client, but I have plenty of clients. And so applying the rationale that you use is that, having the abundance mindset and saying, you know what, I'm going to say no, because the best predictor of past behavior is sometimes, in my opinion, how someone has acted before, right? Like, they've already not honored their agreement in the past. What's to say that they're going to honor it this time? And they didn't respect, before. And why would that be any different? That led me to the decision, to not move forward with that. I don't know if that's an applicable example, but there's a lot of times where I think of doing something in my organization or I think about representing someone, and I need to put it through a lens of whether that's going to be necessarily the best interest of me and my organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I have often found that dynamic dictates behavior. So like in our relationships, whether that's professional or personal, the dynamic that exists between us and the other person sort of dictates that behavior. So for example, if you wrote back to that, I don't know if you've already made that decision, but let's just by way of example, if you wrote back to that person and said, okay, if you and I are going to work together, this is how this has got to go. And you actually lay it out very, very clearly for them, and then you say at the end of writing all that, you can say, can you do that? Yes or no? And then you actually have the opportunity to sort of reset up the dynamic in a different way. And that then can sort of inform their behavior. I have often thought about that, like it's a funny thing how, say, for example, like somebody comes to me and they say, I hate it when people lie to me. I hate when people lie. I just wish people were more honest, let's say. And I say, right, who lies to you where it really bothers you? And they say, my spouse, right? They go, like, if I find out my spouse has been lying about, even if it's a tiny thing or whatever, like, I just hate it. My body fills with anger and whatever. And I said, well, the last time they came clean to you about something that they'd lied to you about, how did you react? And they would go, I went crazy. I went crazy. I was so angry. And I said, well, they're going to lie to you then, aren't they? Like, when they're honest with you, you punish them,
Mm-hmm.
And so, when they tell you the truth, you want to make that a really good experience, because then they're going to want to do that again. If when they come clean and they're honest with you, you punish them, it's like, how many times do you think they're going to do that before they stop? Why would they keep putting themselves in that position? So if we sort of dance it back to sort of your example, right? Do you mind if I speak about that, your example?
Yeah, you totally.
So the thing that I sort of listen to is, like, if they were rude to you before, there might be an opportunity even for you, to sort of, what would you call it, level up or step in, or, whatever, to say, okay, if you and I are going to work together, like, this is how this has got to go. Last time we worked together, that didn't work for me. And I actually wrestled with myself as to whether to even write this to you or not. But I'm going to give you a chance for us to work together. But if we are going to work together, this is how this is going to go. Can you do that? And so if they then come to the party, they grow and you grow, and you set up a new precedent as to how you want to be treated. And you have an opportunity to sort of do that rather than what would you say?
Sure,
it. Yeah, rather than it being just a private conversation that you have with yourself, it's something that you can actually have with them.
I like that. I was thinking of multiple ways to handle it, of being like upfront that, they have to work with me exclusively and I want to do things, differently, and that I expect them to honor the commitment. But I think just being direct,
yeah,
is a tactic I can deploy in the future.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what I mean around, like, dynamic, like the dynamic that you set up, right? The dynamic that you sort of engage in or enter, that you sort of set up, it sets up also the expectations of how that person will behave with you. And so, it's like a good friend of mine who's one of the better sort of psychologists in Sydney. He says, like, relationships are like school, that we teach one another how we want one another to be with each other. And I think that's like spot on. I was working with a client yesterday who runs a small sort of real estate firm, and they got approached by, like, a major client, like a major deal. And this client who sort of came in and wrote them this email and said, like, okay, if we're going to work together, and this is how this has got to go. And they just crunch them on the numbers. They crunch them on price. They crunch them on, sort of dynamic and how this is going to go. They, like, tried to bully them, basically. And my client wrote back to them and said, if this is how you're going to open our engagement, we're not interested in working with you. And the client then wrote back to my client, and said, oh, apologies, we didn't mean that, we didn't mean it like that or whatever. And then my client wrote back to them and said exactly what, we were just talking about. Is like, okay, well, if we're going to work together, this is how this has got to go. And they'd sign them, so again, like, it's not even like a problem with the sort of big client that my client had, it's a dynamic problem. And so if we can sort of reset up the dynamic in a way that works, then that then gives us a much better chance of success. And it helps us grow personally as well.
I think that directness, like, does, instead of using the I'm too busy.
Right.
Because then you're probably closing yourself down to other opportunities. And I may have already sent that email, but I think I've gotten a lot better of having very direct conversations about what expectations are when you're on the phone. But I think when it's email, you get a lot of time to have in your head, and then you're like, well, politically, what do I want to do? But I think, it makes sense to set forth what your expectations are. So
yeah, definitely, because it sets up a new precedent for you around how you want to be treated, and you deserve it. Right.
Absolutely. So this has been a wonderful conversation. What is the best way for someone to reach out to you, or also learn about your book?
Yeah, sure. Like, if they want, they can just come to maxstevenscoaching.com and, feel free to book in a call. I'm happy to chat with anyone.
And it's Max Stevens with a PH, not a V.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So awesome. Well, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything else you want to chat about before we sign off?
No, not at all. Thank you so much for having me again.
Okay, well, I want to thank my listeners for listening to another episode of the Performance Mindset Show. If today's episode gave you something to think about, again, subscribe. And if you want to go deeper, please pick up my book. You can also stay in contact with me at beyondcommerce.com or amycalentino.com. Until next time, stay grounded, stay growing, and keep showing up for you.